Imagine this. It's 1858, and you've just woken up in the heart of London. Middle class, respectable, and the proud new owner of a chamber pot so shiny it almost feels like progress. Congratulations. You're officially one of the best-smelling people in town, which unfortunately is a very low bar. The Victorians built railways, invented photography, and crowned queens. Yet somehow, they forgot the simple miracle of taking a proper bath. Before we dive nose first into history's most pungent century, take a moment to subscribe. You don't want this to be the only clean decision you make today. Tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Hopefully not dinner time. Because this story smells. Now, dim the lights. Breathe in. Not too deeply. Welcome to Victorian London. The city wakes slowly, like a tired giant shaking off another sleepless night. It's dawn in 1850s London, the supposed capital of civilization. And the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of church spires or the sound of horse hooves. It's the smell. A heavy, complicated perfume of coal smoke, damp straw, and yesterday's dinner, drifting up from a million chimneys. Somewhere beneath it all, just faint enough to pretend it isn't there, is the sour undercurrent of sewage, that familiar domestic aroma that tells every Londoner home. Step outside your narrow townhouse, and you join the daily pageant of progress. Across the street, a chimney sweep no older than 12 scrambles onto a rooftop, his face already black with soot. His mother shouts a warning from below, not about the danger of falling, but about catching a chill, or worse, the bad air, because here in London, everyone knows that sickness comes not from germs, but from smells. The cobblestones glisten faintly, though not from rain. Overnight, the gutters have collected a mixture of horse manure, spilled ale, and the gentle overflow of yesterday's chamber pots. This cocktail of life and waste is swept along by a passing milk cart, whose driver hums cheerfully as if nothing's amiss. He's delivering breakfast, or at least something that looks like milk and has probably met a cow at some point in its life. Further up the street, a maid kneels at a doorstep, scrubbing the threshold with a stiff brush and vinegar water. It's part cleaning, part performance, a signal to passers-by that the family inside is respectable. Respectability in this city is measured by how clean your doorstep is, not how clean your conscience or your bathwater. Next door, a banker leaves for work, coat buttoned to the chin, hat polished, and expression neutral. He steps carefully over a puddle of indeterminate origin, pretending not to notice the unmistakable stench rising from the drains. In London, you keep walking. The moment you stop to complain, the smell wins. And everywhere, the noise, the rattle of carriage wheels, the hiss of steam engines, the hawkers shouting their goods. Hot pies, fresh eels. You can almost admire the optimism it takes to yell the word fresh in this part of town. The Victorians called this progress. The empire was booming. Railways stitched the country together, and the Thames, that sluggish brown artery of commerce, carried goods, wealth, and unfortunately, most of London's waste, all in the same current. To live here was to breathe history in real time, literally. The people of London had long ago learned to stop noticing the stench. To the working classes, it was simply the smell of living. To the wealthy, it was the faint price of success, the unavoidable odor of a city that never slept, never stopped building, never stopped burning. The same smoke that darkened your laundry also fueled the machines that made your fortune. The same fog that choked your lungs helped power an empire. There was even a kind of pride in it. As one journalist wrote in the 1850s, "A whiff of London air is the scent of industry itself." Romantic, if you ignore the fact that said industry was mostly composed of sulfur, soot, and the effluvia of several million humans who hadn't discovered indoor plumbing. Still, you could find poetry in it if you tried. Bakers opening their ovens at dawn released sweet plumes of bread and yeast that drifted down the street, mingling with the acrid smoke of the coalman and the iron tang of the blacksmith's forge. A lady stepping out of her carriage would lift her skirts as she crossed the road, the hem gathering a little bit of London with her, a souvenir of civilization's perfume. If you could have bottled the scent of the Victorian morning, it would have smelled like ambition, with notes of manure. Inside homes, the air wasn't much better. Coal fires burned day and night to keep out the chill, covering walls with a fine black powder. Curtains soaked up the smell of smoke and sweat, never quite airing out, even in summer. Bedrooms reeked faintly of paraffin, ink, and human breath. And in every home, somewhere, there lurked a chamber pot, the quiet reminder that progress had its limits. But the people adapted. They always did. The rich disguised it with perfume and incense, the poor with vinegar and prayer. Florists did brisk business, as did vinegar merchants, perfumers, and undertakers. The latter two industries sharing more than one customer base. Down in the poorer districts, Whitechapel, Bermondsey, Clerkenwell, the smell was more honest. There, tanners boiled hides, candlemakers rendered fat, and butchers spilled blood into the drains. The very air felt greasy, as if the city itself was sweating. Yet even here, there was laughter. Children ran barefoot through puddles, women gossiped over washboards, men joked about the stink as if mocking it might make it less real. "Hold your breath when the wind changes," a mother tells her son as they pass the riverbank. "That's the bad air what makes you sick." He obeys, cheeks puffed, eyes wide, the universal language of childhood fear. That's miasma theory in action, Victorian science distilled into one breath. To them, disease traveled on smell itself, foul air creeping through keyholes, infecting lungs, bringing cholera and death. They couldn't see microbes, but they could smell misery, and that was proof enough. The irony, of course, is that they weren't entirely wrong. The smell really did signal danger, just not in the way they thought. It wasn't the stink that killed. It was what caused it. The same filth that offended the nose was quietly poisoning the water. But to the Victorians, ignorance was bliss, and denial was deodorant. So, as the city fully awakens, the fog thickens, and the day begins. You can hear the church bells ringing somewhere in the haze, muffled by smoke and soot. The sound is soft but constant, a reminder that life goes on, even when the air feels barely breathable. And as you take one cautious breath through your nose because you can't help yourself, you realize something strange. You're starting to get used to it. That's how it happens. The first hour is revolting. The second, tolerable. By the third, you barely notice it. That's how London survived. Not by cleaning itself, but by teaching its people to stop noticing. Progress, after all, has a smell. And in the 1850s, London was proud of it. The summer of 1858 began innocently enough, with blue skies, bustling markets, and the kind of deceptive sunlight that makes you forget you live beside an open sewer. Londoners had survived fogs, cholera, and the occasional fire, but that year, something new arrived. something invisible, unstoppable, and unforgettable. It began, as all great disasters do, with a smell. Not the everyday background perfume of London, the polite blend of soot, manure, and mild despair, but a deeper, meaner odor. One that seemed to crawl up from the river itself, climb through the air, and sit in your lungs like an unwelcome tenant. By June, it had become unbearable. By July, it was biblical. The Thames, that proud artery of empire, had turned against its masters. For centuries, London had treated it like a bottomless trash can, a liquid rug under which all filth could be conveniently swept. Everything went into it: factory runoff, animal blood, and roughly 2 million people's worth of human waste. And now, under a heat wave that baked the river into something resembling soup, the Thames decided to give it all back. Picture it: a sheet of brown water shimmering under the sun, dotted with the occasional dead fish or floating cabbage, glinting with oil and the faint rainbow sheen of decay. The air above it shimmered too, but not with light, with vaporized filth. Boatmen on the river fainted mid-row. Their oars sloshed through layers of sludge so thick it clung like porridge. Barges transporting goods had to wrap their cargo in tarred cloth, lest the stench ruin everything inside. And still, Londoners tried to carry on. They had always been resilient, or perhaps just stubborn. The city was used to discomfort. Bad air, foul streets, occasional plagues. But this was something else. This was not a background smell you could ignore. This was a living presence, a monster made of every bad decision the city had ever flushed away. Even Parliament, normally immune to the realities of the world outside its polished doors, could not escape. The Houses of Parliament sat gracefully along the riverbank, which, that summer, meant they were essentially built on top of a toilet. Inside, lawmakers attempted to continue as usual. They opened sessions with the customary solemnity, but within minutes, the stench invaded. Members of Parliament pressed perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, soaked their curtains in lime chloride, and prayed for wind from the north. But there was no mercy. The heat held steady. The smell deepened. One MP reportedly suggested moving Parliament to Oxford until the smell subsided. Another, less optimistic, said they might as well hold meetings underwater. The air's likely fresher there. Newspapers seized the moment. Headlines screamed from every corner: "The Thames is a gutter. The great stink paralyzes London. God forgive us, it is our own doing." At a small print shop near Fleet Street, a weary printer named Henry Thompson wiped sweat from his brow as he set the type. He'd been working 16 hours straight in the oppressive heat, windows sealed to keep the stench out, an irony that only made the air thicker inside. As he arranged the lead letters for "The Thames is a gutter," he muttered under his breath, "A gutter? It's worse than that. A gutter at least drains somewhere." He chuckled to himself, though there was nothing funny about it. The stench had reached his home in Holborn. His wife hung wet towels over the windows, soaked in vinegar, while his children complained of headaches and nausea. Every house, every alley, every breath of air was laced with the same foul signature. And yet the government hesitated. Parliament argued, as Parliament does, about money and priorities. Some said the smell was unpleasant, but temporary. Others argued that the Thames had smelled worse before. But this time, the stink didn't fade. It grew. By August, even the most stoic Victorians were losing patience. Letters to editors turned poetic in their outrage. "It is as if the devil himself had taken residence in the river," one reader wrote. Another quipped, our fair city now competes with hell and is winning on aroma. Doctors feared another cholera outbreak. Scientists dabbed at river samples and recoiled. Clergymen declared it divine punishment. But amid the chaos, one man quietly began to sketch a solution. His name was Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of London's Metropolitan Board of Works. A man with the patience of a saint and the nose of a martyr. While others gagged, Bazalgette worked. He studied maps of the city, tracing the web of old drains and sewers that emptied straight into the Thames. He knew that simply enduring the smell wasn't enough. London needed a new system, vast, elegant, invisible, something that would finally separate human life from its inevitable byproduct. Each night, he worked by candlelight in his study, pencil scratching over parchment. Outside his window, the air was thick and sour. Inside, he drew salvation in straight lines and curves, tunnels beneath the city, colossal sewers carrying waste far downstream. The design was ambitious, expensive, and to some, absurd. But Bazalgette was methodical. "We will build for the future," he said, "because the future will need it." By autumn, Parliament finally yielded, not out of sudden enlightenment, but out of desperation. The smell had grown so unbearable that MPs could no longer meet without vomiting. The vote passed quickly. The money flowed, a rare instance of bureaucracy defeated by biology. Bazalgette's project would take years, but when it was finished, London would be transformed. His sewers, vast enough to stand upright in, would silently carry away the waste that had haunted the city for centuries. And yet, in 1858, that was still a dream. For now, the Thames remained what one poet called the silent ghost of everything we've done wrong. As summer faded and the first autumn chill crept in, the smell finally began to ease. Rain fell, the air cooled, and Londoners emerged from their vinegar-soaked fortresses, blinking into the gray light like survivors of some invisible war. They told stories of the great stink for years afterward, how it brought the city to its knees, how even Parliament had surrendered, how a smell had done what no army could. And somewhere, in a quiet room, Joseph Bazalgette folded his final blueprint, blew out his candle, and sighed. London slept that night, not because the air was clean, but because, for the first time, someone had a plan to make it so. A man had drawn salvation from stench. And though the river would one day run clear, London would never quite forget the summer it couldn't breathe. London, 1850-something. Midnight. The city sleeps. Well, most of it does. Somewhere in the tangled maze of Southwark's alleys, a man named Arthur Bell pulls his coat tighter and lights his lantern. The flame flickers weakly, the smell of hot oil barely masking the heavier odor that already fills the air. Arthur's shift is just beginning. He's a night soil man, one of the hundreds of invisible workers who kept London from drowning in its own success. His tools are simple: a shovel, a rope, and a pair of buckets that no one ever wants to see. Arthur moves slowly, boots squelching in the mud. Or at least, you hope it's mud. The city above ground may be proud, polished, and industrious, but beneath it lies an underworld of laborers like him, the unspoken backbone of Victorian cleanliness. For every fine drawing room lit by gaslight, there's a man like Arthur somewhere below, ankle deep in proof that civilization has consequences. He arrives at his first stop, a row of cramped tenements that huddle together like guilty secrets. The smell hits before he even opens the door, a mixture of ammonia, damp brick, and humanity itself. He's been here before. They all know him, "Evenin', Arthur," a woman murmurs from her doorway, holding a candle. She doesn't meet his eye. Few ever do. Night soil men occupy that strange social no man's land, essential but unwanted. London needs them, but prefers not to remember that. Arthur nods politely. "Evenin', missus." He lowers his lantern and looks at the task ahead, a brick-lined pit that's been quietly filling for weeks beneath the privy, the cesspool. To the tenants, it's a distant problem. To Arthur, it's tonight's job. He lifts the cover and pauses. The sound that greets him is not pleasant. A soft glug, followed by a faint rising hiss. The gases have been waiting too. Arthur ties a rag around his mouth and nose, not that it helps much, and lowers a rope bucket into the pit. He works methodically, like a man resigned to gravity and human nature. Scoop, haul, pour. Scoop, haul, pour. The splash echoes off the brick walls, blending with the rhythmic clink of his tools. Somewhere outside, a drunkard sings a hymn in the wrong key. A cat darts past, offended by everything. Arthur keeps his pace steady. Each bucket is emptied into a barrel hitched to his handcart. By morning, those barrels will be full and very heavy. Londoners may spend their days discussing art, empire, and moral virtue. But Arthur knows the truth. All of it in the end comes to him. Everything fine and noble, every dinner, every drink, every polite conversation, eventually finds its way into his cart. The city produces poetry by day and something else entirely by night. He's paid by the load, not the hour. It's not much, but it's steady, and he's proud of that. He once worked in a tannery, lost half a toe to acid. This job may stink, but at least it doesn't burn. By 2 a.m, the barrels are full. He covers them with tarred cloth, ties them down, and begins the slow trudge toward the outskirts. The cartwheels groan through ruts in the cobblestones. The city fades behind him, street lamps thinning into darkness, the Thames glinting faintly under a sky the color of iron. It's quiet work, just the soft roll of the cart, the occasional slosh, and Arthur's steady breath. He hums to himself to keep awake, a hymn he half remembers from childhood. Out here, past the noise of the city, the air changes. It's still bad, but in a different way, a rural bad. He's nearing the farms. At dawn, he arrives at a small holding beyond Vauxhall. The farmer is already up, boots in the mud, pipe in his mouth. He waves. "Mornin', Arthur. You're early." Arthur tips his cap. Couldn't sleep. The farmer grins. "Smells like you've been working hard." Arthur doesn't bother replying. The farmer lifts the tar cloth and takes a cautious sniff, grimaces, then nods approvingly. "Good stuff. Rich." "London's finest," Arthur says, deadpan. They share a laugh, brief but real. Then the deal is made. A few shillings for the barrels. The waste will be mixed into compost, spread over the fields, and feed next season's crops. London's leftovers reborn as food. Civilization, it seems, is a perfect circle, and Arthur is somewhere near the middle. He washes his hands at the pump, cold water, no soap, and rubs his arms to fight the morning chill. The sun is coming up, weak and white, glinting off the dew in the distant city skyline. Smoke already rises from 1,000 chimneys, carrying the day's new round of smells into the air. Arthur climbs onto his empty cart and looks back at London. He can't see the people, just the rooftops, the towers, the river winding like a lazy serpent through it all. But he knows they're there, already waking, making breakfast, opening shop doors, taking breaths they won't think twice about. And for a moment, he feels oddly content. His work may be filthy, but it keeps the city breathing. No one thanks him, No one remembers him, but they don't have to. The proof of his labor is in the silence, in the fact that when they flush, they never wonder where it goes. He takes one last look at the horizon, the pale gold light breaking through the haze. Then he clicks his tongue to the horse, a tired old mare named Bess, and turns back toward home. He'll sleep through the morning, eat in the afternoon, and start again that night. London's endless cycle of creation and disposal will continue, as it always does. But for now, as the city stirs and bells begin to toll in the distance, Arthur allows himself a small smile. Because somewhere, behind all that grandeur and noise, he knows the truth. London sleeps clean because Arthur doesn't. He did the dirty work. You just have to do the decent thing and subscribe. The Victorians loved progress. They adored inventions, machinery, and anything that made life seem a little more civilized. So when the indoor toilet arrived, it wasn't just a convenience. It was a statement. Having one meant you'd officially join the ranks of modern humanity. You, too, could now eliminate with elegance. At least, that was the idea. Let's begin in a respectable London townhouse, where Mrs. Eliza Merriweather, wife of a prosperous merchant, is proudly showing off her new acquisition to her neighbor. "It's called a water closet," she declares, hand on hip, eyes sparkling with pride. So much more refined than those dreadful outdoor privies. The neighbor nods politely, pretending not to notice the faint odor already wafting up through the floorboards. The device gleams. Porcelain, brass fittings, a wooden seat polished to a shine. Beside it, a dainty jug and basin sit ready for washing one's hands, as though this room were just another branch of the parlor. Eliza is thrilled. It flushes with a satisfying rush of water, or at least it's supposed to. What she doesn't realize, as she beams with pride, is that her shiny new toilet isn't connected to any proper sewer. The waste simply travels a few feet downward, into a cesspit beneath the house. It's progress, just in the wrong direction. Weeks later, on a humid August afternoon, something strange begins to happen. At first, there's a faint gurgle beneath the floorboards, like a kettle that never stops boiling. Then comes the smell, subtle at first, then less so. Within days, the parlor fills with an aroma that even the heaviest draperies can't disguise. The servants swear it's coming from the cellar. Eliza insists it's the neighbors. By the end of the week, the truth can no longer be ignored. The cesspit is full. And as physics so cruelly dictates, what goes down must eventually come up. When the local nightman arrives to empty it, he lifts the hatch and recoils, not from the sight, which he's long accustomed to, but from the ominous hiss that follows. Gas. Methane, trapped beneath weeks of waste, stirred by the summer heat. He mutters a prayer, strikes a match for his lantern, and boom. The sound rattles windows down the street. Neighbors rush outside in their night clothes, convinced the boiler's exploded. But no, it's worse. The Merriweather residence has suffered a sanitary incident, the polite term for an indoor eruption of modern plumbing. The damage is substantial. The parlor carpet will never recover, nor arguably will Mrs. Merriweather's reputation. She spends the next month pretending her water closet never existed. The servants are told to refer to it only as the back inconvenience. Her husband, meanwhile, considers returning to chamber pots. At least, he reasons, those never explode. A few streets away, in the narrow alleys of Clerkenwell, the story is less glamorous, but no less pungent. Here, 30 families share a single outdoor privy, a wooden shed built over a pit that hasn't been emptied since the Crimean War. By day, the smell lingers like an unwanted guest. By night, it becomes unbearable. The children call it the dragon's mouth. A mother named Agnes approaches the outhouse one evening with a candle in one hand and her youngest child in the other. She pushes open the warped door and steps inside, immediately regretting every decision that brought her here. The stench is overwhelming, thick enough to taste. The floorboards creak underfoot, threatening to collapse into the abyss below. She sets down the candle, balancing it on a shelf, and mutters a quick prayer. A small spark falls from the flame. The result is immediate. A muffled whoomp, followed by a wave of heat and the unmistakable roar of ignited methane. The wooden walls tremble. The door flies open. Agnes stumbles out coughing, her eyebrows singed, but her sense of humor somehow intact. From that day on, the neighborhood refers to the privy as Old Smoky. These weren't isolated incidents. Victorian toilets exploded often enough to make the newspapers. Methane gas built up in sealed cesspits, ignited by a stray candle, lantern, or pipe ember. The results ranged from terrifying to absurd. Whole outhouses sent skyward, indoor privies turned into geysers, and one unfortunate gentleman who, according to the Times, suffered considerable alarm and partial loss of trousers. To put it plainly, London had conquered half the globe, but could not yet conquer its own bowels. Still, for many, even a risky privy was better than nothing. In the poorest corners of the city, people relieved themselves wherever they could, alleys, gutters, or convenient corners. It wasn't laziness, it was survival. When 30 people shared one facility, you learned to improvise. "Guardy-loo!" street hawkers would cry, a holdover from the French "Gardez-l'eau." Watch out for the water. It wasn't water, of course. It was the polite warning before a chamber pot was emptied out a window. Pedestrians learned to listen for it. Some even carried umbrellas for protection. The city authorities tried to keep up. Inspectors were appointed to check cesspools, but there were thousands of them, some shallow, others deep enough to drown in. Night soil men worked through the dark hours, emptying pits before dawn, their carts rattling down the cobblestones. The system functioned barely, held together by habit and denial. Meanwhile, inventors raced to perfect new designs. The valve closet, pan closet, and plunger closet all claimed to eliminate smell. They didn't. A true flush toilet required something far more radical, proper sewers, which brings us back faintly to Joseph Bazalgette, the man sketching salvation beneath flickering lamplight. But at this point in our story, his plans are still paper dreams, and London's bathrooms remain little temples of risk. If you'd walked through a London street in the 1850s, you'd have seen the contradiction everywhere. Respectable townhouses with elegant facades and cesspits bubbling underneath, mansions filled with chandeliers, servants, and the faint odor of methane creeping up the stairs. Progress perched delicately atop rot. And yet, people kept building, kept inventing, kept flushing, because in their minds the future was already here. Porcelain, gleaming, slightly dangerous, but beautiful all the same. Civilization had entered the house. The only problem was that it didn't always know how to leave. So the next time you turn a handle and watch water whisk away your daily regrets, spare a thought for Mrs. Merriweather and her exploded parlor, for Agnes and Old Smoky, and for every night soil man who risked his eyebrows for the greater good. Because the Victorians may have ruled the world, but they still hadn't figured out plumbing. The Victorian world smelled of many things: smoke, sewage, sweat, and ambition. But underneath it all, there lingered the faint, hopeful scent of soap. Not the soap we know today, soft and perfumed and promising miracles, but something rougher, meaner, half salvation, half punishment. Because in 19th century Britain, cleanliness wasn't just a matter of hygiene, it was a matter of morality. To wash was to prove yourself good. To be dirty was to risk being seen as sinful. And if that sounds absurd, congratulations, you'd have been very unpopular in Victorian London. Let's begin on a bright afternoon in 1862 at a little shop on Oxford Street. The door opens with a cheerful chime, and you're greeted by the scent of almonds, lemon oil, and the faint whiff of industrial chemistry. A clerk in a tidy waistcoat stands behind the counter, his smile as polished as the brass bell on the door. On the shelves behind him are rows upon rows of small, perfect rectangles, translucent, golden, glimmering in the sunlight like jewels. "Good day, madam," he chirps. "Might I interest you in the Pear's transparent soap?" He holds up a bar for you to admire. It's beautiful, clear enough to see your reflection, if you don't mind looking slightly orange. "This," he says reverently, "is the future of cleanliness. Pure, refined, and civilized, just like the people who use it." He doesn't need to say unlike the people who don't. The message is clear. Pear's soap wasn't merely soap, it was an identity, a declaration that you were clean in body and spirit. Its advertisements would soon feature cherubic babies, white linen, and moral slogans like, "Cleanliness is next to godliness." The Victorians believed that a pure body led to a pure soul, and conveniently, a more respectable reputation. It was brilliant marketing, guilt in a box. But not everyone could afford purity. A few miles away, in a cramped kitchen in Whitechapel, Mary Ellis is trying to make her own soap. The air is thick with the smell of boiling fat and something sharper. Lye, a corrosive substance made from ashes and water. She stirs the pot with a wooden spoon that's seen better days, her hands red and raw from splashes. Her youngest child, perched on a stool, watches silently. Mary wipes her forehead with the back of her wrist. She can't afford Pear's or anything like it. Factory soap costs too much, and the cheap versions are full of sand or chalk. Good for scrubbing, bad for skin. So she does what generations of poor women have done. She makes do. Her mixture thickens slowly, bubbling like a cauldron in a storybook, though this one has no magic, only survival. When it cools, she'll cut it into crude gray bars and set them by the window to harden. It won't smell like almonds or lemon oil. It'll smell like smoke, salt, and desperation. But it will work, sort of. By morning, her hands will sting. The lye eats at skin as eagerly as it eats at dirt. The irony isn't lost on her. To be clean, she must first be burned. Back on Oxford Street, the clerk is polishing the counter. A wealthy couple enters, their clothes immaculate, their perfume carrying notes of rosewater and superiority. "Ah," says the husband, plucking up a bar of pears, "this is the one Her Majesty recommends, isn't it?" "So it is, sir," says the clerk with a bow. "The very same. It's said to be most effective at removing city grime and other impurities." The couple exchange a knowing glance. They buy a dozen bars. When they leave, the clerk returns to his polishing, smiling faintly. He doesn't use Pear's himself. The shop provides the cheaper stuff for employees. His hands are cracked and pale beneath the cuffs. But the smell in the air, that clean, almost holy aroma, feels like success. In Victorian society, cleanliness became a hierarchy. The upper classes bathed in scented luxury, scrubbing away the faintest trace of labor. The middle classes washed with pride, their new bathrooms serving as proof of respectability. And the poor, well, they did their best, which usually wasn't enough. Soap became a silent divider. The scent of your skin could betray your class before you spoke a word. Reformers and moralists reinforced the idea. They preached that cleanliness led to discipline, discipline led to morality, and morality led, naturally, to wealth. Poverty, therefore, was not just unfortunate, it was unclean. As one pamphlet put it, the idle man is dirty, the clean man industrious. The logic was flawless, as long as you ignored reality. Advertising only deepened the divide. By the 1880s, soap companies had begun exporting not just products, but values. British brands like Pears and Lever Brothers marketed soap across the empire, tying cleanliness to civilization itself. Their posters featured radiant white bodies contrasted against darker-skinned savages, accompanied by slogans like "The White Man's Burden," to teach cleanliness. Soap was no longer just about washing hands. It was about washing consciences. Back home, magazines told women that good mothers scrubbed, that good wives smelled pleasant, that good children were spotless. Clean skin became shorthand for moral worth. Even literature joined in. Dickens, for instance, filled his novels with grimy villains and well-scrubbed heroes. If your soul was in question, a bar of Pears was the nearest thing to repentance. But for Mary in her tiny kitchen, such ideals were laughable. She couldn't afford guilt wrapped in cellophane. Her days revolved around keeping her children alive and her home from smelling too much like life. When she washed, it wasn't for virtue. It was for dignity. To feel, even briefly, that she wasn't dissolving into the dirt around her. On Sundays, she'd boil water for a family bath. The eldest went first, the youngest last, the water turning cloudy by the end. They'd emerge smelling faintly of soap, smoke, and iron pots, but cleaner, and that was enough. Her neighbors might sniff and talk about the new morality of soap, but Mary knew the truth. Morality didn't make you clean. Hard work did, and lie, and a bit of pain. As the century wore on, soap became as common as sin itself. Prices dropped. Factories multiplied. The working poor could finally buy what the rich had long used to separate themselves from everyone else. But even then, the meaning lingered. A spotless collar, a scented wrist, a polished fingernail. These weren't just signs of hygiene. They were symbols of order, obedience, aspiration. Soap had cleaned more than bodies. It had scrubbed the Victorian conscience, leaving behind a faint shine of self-satisfaction. Back in her shop, Mrs. Merriweather, her parlor long recovered from its plumbing incident, now insists her servants use Pears exclusively. It keeps the house civilized, she says, unaware that the woman scrubbing her floors buys her own bar secondhand. In another kitchen, Mary wraps her rough soap in a scrap of cloth. She gives it to her neighbor with a smile. "Be careful," she says. "It burns a bit, but it'll do." The neighbor nods, grateful. She'll use it tonight, after work, and for a moment she'll feel human again. The Victorians may have preached cleanliness as virtue, but the truth was simpler. The rich washed for virtue, the poor washed for survival. And somewhere in between, the rest of London just tried not to smell like either. Saturday evening. The hearth glows, the kettle hisses. Somewhere in a narrow London row house, the ritual begins. Bath night. For most Victorian families, Bathing wasn't an everyday luxury. It was an event, a logistical challenge, a domestic performance involving kettles, buckets, patience, and more moral pressure than steam. We begin with the Pembertons, a respectable lower-middle-class family who take their cleanliness seriously, or as seriously as one can when water has to be carried in by hand. Mrs. Pemberton has been heating water all afternoon, pouring it into a tin tub set by the kitchen fire. The tub itself is small, more optimistic than accommodating, and the water within it is at best lukewarm. Still, it's progress. "Right then," says Mr. Pemberton, removing his waistcoat like a man about to wrestle an eel. "Let's make it quick before it gets cold." He steps into the bath with a noise that's half sigh, half groan, a sound echoed across Victorian London every Saturday night. Steam rises briefly, then fades. Mrs. Pemberton stands nearby, arms folded, waiting to hand him the soap, a dull gray lump that smells faintly of lard and morality. He scrubs. He winces. The soap squeaks against skin that hasn't seen hot water since last week. Feels grand, he lies. After 5 minutes of determined effort, he stands, dripping, shivering, and slightly pink, the universal sign of virtue achieved through discomfort. Next. The children appear in order of age and importance. The eldest goes second, the youngest last. With each turn, the water cools, darkens, and acquires an aroma best described as collective effort. By the time baby Clara is lowered into the tub, the water has achieved the color and temperature of weak tea. She splashes happily anyway. The Pembertons beam. "Clean as a whistle," says Mrs. Pemberton proudly as she wrings out the rag. "All ready for Sunday service." Of course, by morning they'll smell faintly of damp wool and determination, but in Victorian England that's practically the scent of respectability. Now cross town to Belgravia, where bathing is a very different experience. In a townhouse lined with velvet drapes and marble floors, Lady Constance Fairley is preparing for her evening soak. Her bathroom is a wonder of modern innovation, tiled, perfumed, and spacious enough to fit the Pembertons' entire kitchen. She reclines gracefully on a chaise, while 2 maids fill the marble tub by hand, each trip requiring another kettle from the scullery below. Steam fills the room, mingling with the scent of rose oil. It takes an hour to fill completely. A full hour of hissing kettles, sloshing water, and the occasional muttered curse from a servant scalding her wrist. When it's finally ready, Lady Constance tests the temperature with one elegant finger. "A touch cooler," she instructs, as if nature herself can be adjusted. More kettles are fetched, more sighs are exchanged. At last, the moment arrives. The lady steps delicately into the water, her skin pale against the marble, and exhales a satisfied sigh. For her, bathing is less hygiene, more theater, an act of refinement. On a nearby table lies a copy of The Art of Bathing, a popular guide for the nervous bather. Inside are instructions on how long to soak. No more than 10 minutes, lest one become too relaxed. What to wear. A light linen wrap for modesty. And what mental state to maintain while submerged. Cheerful thoughts encourage circulation. Victorians had a manual for everything, even self-cleansing. The book warns against bathing after meals, before church, or during menstruation, and recommends following each bath with vigorous rubbing, not for cleanliness, but for moral fortitude. It also includes charming advice, such as, avoid bathing when the east wind blows, as it invites melancholy. One wonders how many readers actually obeyed. Of course, not everyone bathed at home. For the vast majority of Londoners, Hot water and privacy were luxuries beyond reach. Instead, they went to public bathhouses, those temples of steam and soap built to purify the working class, or at least to make them less noticeable. Inside, attendants shouted instructions over clouds of vapor. 2 pence for the hot, towels extra. Men lined up for their turn, clutching bars of soap in their dignity. The water wasn't always clean, but it was warmer than most kitchens, and for a few glorious minutes, they could pretend to be gentlemen. Women's baths were quieter, but no less busy. A chorus of chatter, laughter, and complaints about soap prices. Children splashed, mothers scolded, old women soaked their feet and swapped gossip. It wasn't glamorous, but it was communal. A few minutes of warmth, of normalcy, of being something other than poor. And if anyone left cleaner than they arrived, it was purely incidental. Despite all this effort, many Victorians still feared bathing too much. Doctors warned that hot water could open the pores and invite illness. Some believed too frequent washing drained strength from the body, a sort of aquatic exhaustion. The upper classes compromised by taking sponge baths, delicately dabbing at the visible areas, while leaving the rest to imagination. One journalist noted, with admirable restraint, that the Victorians were a people of clean faces and mysterious undergarments. Perfume, powder, and vinegar-soaked cloths did the rest. Even Queen Victoria herself was cautious. Her letters mentioned bathing as a rare indulgence, an act of necessity rather than pleasure. Her physicians, ever dutiful, advised moderation. A full immersion should be considered a remedy, not a recreation. Back at the Pemberton house, the bathwater has finally cooled. The tin tub sits by the fire, looking sullen and defeated. Mrs. Pemberton empties it out into the yard, where it steams faintly in the cold night air. She looks tired but content. The ritual is complete. Her family is officially clean. For now. Across the city, Lady Constance is being helped from her bath, her hair wrapped in linen, her skin perfumed. She sighs, serene and spotless. Tomorrow, her servants will scrub the marble tub until it gleams again, and they, of course, will wash in cold water at the pump. Different homes, different classes, same story. Cleanliness in Victorian England was as unevenly distributed as wealth. Some soaked in luxury, others in shared grime, but all believed in the same truth, that bathing, however rare or ridiculous, meant civilization. When the fires burn low and London grows quiet, you can almost hear it, the faint hiss of cooling water, the drip of a leaky tap, the sigh of a body finally still. Across thousands of homes, rich and poor alike, people settle into bed with the same quiet thought. I've done my duty. They may not smell much better, but they feel better. And that perhaps is what mattered most. Because in the end, no matter how much soap you used or how hot the water ran, one thing remained true. Few felt truly clean. Most simply felt cold. Monday morning. For most of us, Monday means coffee and complaint. For the Victorian woman, Monday meant war. The battleground was the washhouse, and the enemies were many. Mud, soot, grease, blood, and the faint smell of regret baked into every garment. Step inside one of these places, and you'll understand why the word laundress was both a job title and a warning. The air is a thick fog of steam and soap. Copper pots bubble like cauldrons, filled with sheets that have seen too much life. Wooden washboards line the walls, each one manned by a woman with sleeves rolled up and expression set to eternal suffering. The noise is relentless. The slap of wet cloth, the scrape of knuckles, the hiss of boiling water, and the endless chatter that makes it all bearable. This is the communal washhouse, a kind of domestic purgatory where cleanliness is earned through pain, gossip, and elbow grease. "Got any chalk?" one woman asks, voice raised over the steam. "Only a bit. You got kerosene?" "Aye, but it's for the bloodstains. My Tom came home from the docks again." The exchange sounds casual, like swapping recipes, because it is. Laundry, in the 19th century, was half science, half sorcery. Victorian women had a recipe for everything. Grease stains? Rub them with chalk dust or crushed fuller's earth, natural absorbents that sucked up oil like magic. Ink stains? A mix of lemon juice and milk? Leave it in the sun and pray to Saint Martha, patron saint of household miracles. Blood? Kerosene. Just enough to dissolve the evidence without dissolving the fabric. And if you think that sounds dangerous, congratulations. You'd have lived longer than most. Odor? Milk, oddly enough. Soak the cloth in sour milk, rinse, and pretend it's an improvement. And for the truly ambitious stains, the ones that laughed in the face of soap, there was always urine. Yes, you heard right. Human urine. Nature's original bleach. It was cheap, abundant, and shockingly effective. Collect the morning kind, old laundry guides advised, as it possesses greater potency. One imagines Victorian families contributing to the cause with the same civic pride others reserve for recycling. By midday, the washhouse smells like a chemistry experiment gone wrong. Ammonia stings the eyes, steam clings to every surface. Sweat runs down faces already pink from heat. The women don't stop. They can't. Laundry waits for no one. They scrub until their hands turn red and raw, the skin splitting around the knuckles. There are no gloves, no gentle detergents, no softeners. Only lye, soda ash, and the stubbornness of those who've been told that cleanliness equals character. Because in the Victorian mind, a clean home reflected a clean soul. Dirty linen wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a moral failure. A good wife kept her laundry immaculate. A bad one let the neighbors see her stains. In the corner, a girl named Edith, barely 14, hauls a bucket twice her size to the rinsing tub. She's an apprentice laundress, earning a few pennies a week and the privilege of sore muscles. She wipes her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a smear of soap and soot. "Faster, love," her employer calls. "The lady's expecting her sheets by supper." "Yes, miss." Edith plunges her arms into the water again, wincing as the lye bites at her skin. She doesn't complain. The older women have scars like hers, pale, shiny patches across the hands where skin gave up years ago. They wear them like medals. Lunch is eaten standing, a hunk of bread, a mug of weak tea, followed by another round of boiling, scrubbing, and wringing. The rhythm of it is hypnotic, almost holy. Scrub, rinse, wring, hang, repeat. By late afternoon, sheets flap like surrender flags on the line outside, steam rising from them as if exorcising the city itself. The women finally sit, backs aching, skirts damp to the knees. Someone cracks a joke about the smell. Laughter ripples through the room like relief. Meanwhile, in wealthier districts, laundry happens on an entirely different planet. In houses like Lady Constance Fairley's, linen is sent out to professional laundresses, the invisible army that keeps her drawing rooms dazzling. The servants wash her silk underthings by hand, with imported French soap scented like violets. They hang them in the garden, hidden behind hedges so the neighbors won't see. The irony, of course, is that the ladies who smell of rosewater owe it to women who smell of smoke and ammonia. And everyone, rich or poor, is trapped in the same cycle. Clothes get dirty, and someone, usually a woman, pays the price to make them pure again. Not all laundry was domestic. Some laundresses worked for hospitals, barracks, and hotels, processing mountains of linens every day. Their shifts stretched 14 hours or more. Steam burns were common. Fainting wasn't unusual. They were paid by the piece, a cruel arrangement that rewarded speed over safety. If you were too slow, you went hungry. If you worked too hard, you simply collapsed. And yet somehow they managed to find dignity in the drudgery. They sang while they worked, hymns, folk songs, anything with rhythm. The washhouse became its own kind of choir, the sound of 100 women keeping time against exhaustion. A visiting reporter once described it as a place of great heat, greater labor, and greatest endurance. He wrote that line from a safe distance, of course. By evening, the fires die down. The last kettles are emptied, the tubs scrubbed clean for the next week's onslaught. The floor is slick with water, the air heavy with soap. Edith lingers at the door, stretching her fingers. The older women tease her gently. "Don't worry, love, they'll toughen up soon." She smiles, tired but proud. Her arms ache, her hands sting, and she smells like a mixture of ash, vinegar, and courage. When she walks home through the fog, she'll pass gentlemen in crisp collars, ladies in spotless gowns, all blissfully unaware that their brightness came from hands like hers. Laundry wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, but it kept the illusion of order alive. Clean clothes meant dignity. Dignity meant hope. And hope, however faint, was what kept the washhouses humming. By the end of the day, every garment is lighter, whiter, and hanging proudly in the evening breeze. The women, on the other hand, slump on benches, half asleep, forearms streaked with lye burns. One of them yawns and mutters, "Well, that's Monday done. Only 6 days till the next one." Laughter again, dry, weary, defiant. Because in Victorian London the laundry never really ended. It just cooled overnight. The clothes came out lighter, the women came out half dead. Somewhere, in the ghostly steam of a London washhouse, 1,000 laundresses are still scrubbing away, so that history and this story can stay crisp and white for you. The least you can do is lift a finger, not a washboard. Subscribe and honor the cleanest hard work you never had to do. There's a certain romance to the Victorian image. Candlelight glinting off polished mirrors, lace collars, and neatly parted hair. But step closer, and that shine, that glossy, well-kept halo, might not be what it seems. Because behind every perfect curl and dignified sideburn was a sticky, smelly, and occasionally poisonous secret. Hair care in the 19th century was less a science and more an act of faith. Let's begin in a narrow boarding house bedroom, where Miss Ada Gray, a young governess, is performing her morning ritual. She sits before a cracked mirror, sleeves rolled up, jaw set in grim determination. On the table before her, a small bowl, a comb missing a few teeth, and one lonely chicken egg. With a sigh, she cracks it open, plop, and tips the yolk into the bowl. The recipe she follows came from a magazine called The Lady's Domestic Guide to Beauty and Refinement. It reads, "For lustrous locks, take 1 egg, 1 teaspoon of rum, and a dash of vinegar. Apply gently as you would affection." Miss Gray stirs dutifully, ignoring the smell. She dips her fingers in and begins to rub the mixture into her scalp. It's cold, slimy, and immediately regrettable. Still, she soldiers on, rubbing it through her hair as the faint scent of breakfast fills the air. The yolk clings to every strand like ambition, and she thinks of her employer's wife, Lady Merriweather, whose hair always seems to glimmer like silk in the lamplight. Of course, Lady Merriweather can afford the good stuff, a product called Macassar oil, sold in elegant bottles and advertised as the secret to beauty and virtue. Miss Grey, on the other hand, settles for poultry. Meanwhile, in a very different part of London, the air smells masculine. Welcome to the Albion Club, a gentleman's refuge where cigar smoke and vanity mingle freely. A row of men sit before the great mirror, perfecting their mustaches as if preparing for war. The star of the show? Pomade, thick, greasy, and indispensable, made from bear fat. Yes, actual bear fat, mixed with wax and a touch of perfume to disguise the horror of it. A valet stands ready, dabbing a little onto each gentleman's fingertips. "A touch more at the side, sir," he murmurs. "It catches the light." The men nod sagely, each pretending not to notice that the air now smells like a wrestling match between a bear and a bouquet. Pomade gave Victorian men a certain confidence, the illusion of control in a world where one's hair, much like one's empire, was expected to remain orderly at all times. But the pomade had its price. It stained collars, ruined upholstery, and left pillows slick as skating rinks. The problem grew so widespread that housewives began sewing protective covers over their chairs, known quite seriously as anti-macassars. Yes, the entire decorative lace movement began as an anti-pomade campaign. Civilization owes its doilies to greasy men. Of course, the Victorians didn't stop at bear grease and eggs. No, that would be reasonable. The 19th century was an age of invention, and nowhere was that more dangerous than in the pursuit of eternal youth. By the 1860s, hair tonics had become a booming business. Dozens of brands promised miracle cures for baldness, premature graying, and lifeless locks. And the ingredients? A delightful cocktail of alcohol, arsenic, and lead acetate, a toxic compound that, according to the ads, restores color to hair and vigor to spirit. One of the most famous offenders was Hall's Sicilian Hair Renewer, proudly marketed as guaranteed to rejuvenate the scalp. It did. It also poisoned it. Users reported headaches, dizziness, numb fingers, and in extreme cases, paralysis. But they did have shiny hair, right up until they stopped breathing. The irony is that the Victorians were obsessed with naturalness. They wanted their hair to appear thick, soft, and effortless, even if achieving that natural look required substances capable of stripping paint. Then there was dyeing. The wealthy could afford hairdressers who mixed elegant concoctions of walnut oil, iron filings, and henna. The poor resorted to whatever they could find: coal dust, boot polish, burnt cork. One particularly enterprising Londoner even used ink, which worked beautifully until it rained. There were also fringe treatments involving ammonia vapors and scalp stimulants, early forerunners of hair restorers that promised to awaken the sleeping follicles. Most simply awakened headaches. Men worried just as much as women. Baldness was a national anxiety. Pamphlets warned that thinning hair indicated weakness, moral decay, or a disordered brain. One suspects most of those pamphlets were written by men with excellent hair. Enter the snake oil salesman, literal and figurative. Traveling barbers sold regrowth elixirs, brewed from herbal extracts and wishful thinking. If the mixture didn't work, they blamed the user's lack of faith. Yet, for all the absurdity, there was tenderness in the ritual. Hair care wasn't just vanity. It was self-respect. For women, combing and oiling their hair each night was a moment of quiet, one of the few acts of control in lives ruled by expectation. For working-class men, smoothing back their hair before church was a kind of armor, a small defiance against the grime that defined their days. Miss Gray, our long-suffering governess, knows this well. After the egg has dried and been carefully rinsed away, she sits by the fire, brushing her hair until it shines faintly in the flickering light. It smells faintly of vinegar and optimism. She ties it back neatly, smooths her dress, and prepares to teach her pupils geography. Children who will grow up believing that cleanliness is next to godliness, without ever realizing how much vinegar it takes to reach heaven. Across town, in the warm glow of the Albion Club, the gentlemen finish their grooming. Their sideburns gleam, their mustaches shine. They are paragons of order, until one scratches his head and mutters, "Good Lord, Jenkins, is that bear grease?" Jenkins smiles proudly. "Only the finest." The others nod in approval. They smell atrocious. They feel magnificent. By the end of the century, things began to improve. Science, ever late to the party, finally caught up. Chemists replaced lead with safer compounds, and manufacturers began experimenting with glycerin, herbal extracts, and perfumes that didn't double as insecticides. But the myths persisted. A lady's crowning glory, the magazines continued to call it, a man's mane of pride. Even now we chase that same glossy illusion, though thankfully fewer of us are rubbing poultry into our scalps. Still, there's something hauntingly human about it. This endless desire to look radiant, to seem composed, to feel, for one fleeting moment, untouchable. The Victorians simply took that desire and bottled it, along with a few poisons. So tonight, if you find yourself brushing your hair absent-mindedly, spare a thought for those who did it with a candle stub and a bowl of egg yolk. Because for all their mess, for all their fumes and foolishness, they shared the same dream, to shine, and shine they did. Their hair shone in candlelight and glowed faintly in the dark. It's a bright morning in 1854, and London is smiling. Well, trying to. Victorian dentistry was not for the faint of heart. A good smile in this age was less about hygiene and more about courage, class, and sheer luck. Because if your teeth survived the 19th century, you were either very rich, very rural, or very stubborn. Let's begin with Thomas, a 10-year-old errand boy from the East End. His teeth are already yellowed from soot and sweet tea, but he has a routine, one he's proud of. Each morning, before running messages for the grocer, he finds a fresh stalk of celery, snaps it in half, and chews. His mother told him celery keeps your teeth clean. "Brushin's for toffs," she'd said. "You chew and spit? Same thing." So Thomas chews, gnawing methodically as he walks. The fibers scrape the grime from his teeth, more or less. When he's done, he spits into the gutter with an air of accomplishment. And for the time, that's fairly normal. Toothbrushes existed, delicate little things with bone handles and boar bristles, but they were expensive. A working man could buy a week's worth of bread for the same price. So, the poor improvised, chewing twigs, celery stalks, sometimes cloth dipped in salt. Anything vaguely abrasive would do. Toothpaste, meanwhile, was a minor horror. Recipes varied, but a typical mix included soot, crushed seashells, and chalk, a blend that scoured enamel like sandpaper and left you wondering whether your teeth were clean or simply smaller. If you were truly unlucky, your toothpaste contained brick dust or gunpowder. Still, people used it faithfully, scrubbing away in dim candlelight, chasing that mythical, healthy smile, even if the result was more battlefield than beauty. Of course, the wealthy had options. In Belgravia, Lady Constance Fairlie, yes, her again, sits before her vanity, dabbing at her lips with rose water and inspecting her teeth in a silver mirror. She smiles. It's dazzling. Too dazzling. That's because they aren't hers. Her teeth were made by a talented craftsman in Covent Garden, a man who prided himself on his material sourcing. His secret? Waterloo. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, enterprising scavengers descended upon the field, not for gold, but for teeth. Thousands of young soldiers, mostly from Britain and France, lay dead, their mouths intact. Within days, the dead were relieved of their dental duties. The teeth were cleaned, sorted, and shipped to London, where they were polished and fitted into dentures. They were marketed as Waterloo teeth, a mark of quality, if not morality. For decades, the trade thrived. Dentures made from soldiers' teeth were prized among the upper classes, especially women who valued a youthful, natural smile. The irony? The youthful part came from someone who never got to grow old. When Lady Constance smiles at dinner, her admirers compliment her perfect teeth. She blushes modestly. "All mine," she says softly. And in a way, she's not entirely wrong. She did pay for them. Meanwhile, in the poorer quarters, dentistry was less refined and more improvisational. Enter Mr. Hargreaves, barber by day, dentist by night, or sometimes both at once. His shop smells of shaving soap, tobacco, and faint dread. The sign above the door reads, "Haircut, tooth drawn, bleeding done, fast cheap." Inside, a customer sits rigid in the chair, gripping the armrests. "Just a bit of pressure," Mr. Hargreaves says, which, in Victorian terms, means you're about to see God. He offers a mug of gin, the closest thing to anesthesia available, and sets to work with a pair of iron pliers that look suspiciously like they were made for horses. There's a muffled scream, a wet pop, and a triumphant flourish as the tooth comes free. "Done," he announces, dropping it into a jar already half full. The patient staggers out, pale but relieved. Hargreaves wipes his hands and takes a sip of the leftover gin. It's a fair exchange, one tooth for one drink. In truth, dentistry in this era was brutal for everyone. Even professionals, the few that existed, had limited understanding of sterilization or pain management. Ether and chloroform were known, but risky and reserved for hospitals. Most extractions were done dry, meaning you simply gripped the chair and screamed into your sleeve. And yet, people lined up for it. The pain of a rotten tooth was worse. Dental abscesses could kill. Infection was a silent executioner. So, when the barber said open wide, you did. Some Victorians, desperate for better solutions, tried home remedies that ranged from creative to suicidal. Rubbing tobacco ash on gums to strengthen the root. Gargling with brandy, which worked briefly, then ruined your liver. Holding a hot coal near the cheek to burn out the pain. And for the romantically inclined, kissing a frog. It didn't work, but it did start some very awkward relationships. By the 1880s, things began to improve. Real dentists, trained ones, started appearing in London. They wore white coats, used reclining chairs, and advertised with polite signs rather than blood-stained ones. Toothbrushes became cheaper too, thanks to mass production. Middle-class families began brushing regularly, and dental care joined the ranks of respectable habits, like punctuality and not dying of cholera. But the stigma of bad teeth remained. A smile could betray your social standing faster than your accent. Rotten teeth meant poverty. Perfect ones meant privilege, or Waterloo. Even Queen Victoria herself was said to fret over dental fashion. Her diaries mention her personal dentist, a certain Dr. Weiss, who visited the palace monthly. He was rumored to extract teeth from patients during the day and dine with them that evening, a detail best left unconfirmed. Our friend Thomas, the celery-chewing errand boy, grows up eventually. He never sees a real dentist, but he keeps most of his teeth through a combination of stubbornness and ignorance. By the time he's old, his smile is crooked but honest, a rarity in his time. Lady Constance, on the other hand, outlives her first set of dentures, then her second. Each new pair is made from less heroic sources: animal bone, porcelain, vulcanized rubber. But she never forgets her first smile, those perfect white teeth that came, quite literally, from the battlefield. By the turn of the century, dentistry had entered its modern age. Numbing agents, sterilized tools, even early toothpaste tubes. But the ghosts of the old ways lingered, in barber shops that still smelled faintly of gin and blood, and in the bone-white smiles of the upper class. So next time you flash your teeth in the mirror, consider the Victorians. The boy with his celery stick, the barber with his pliers, the lady with her borrowed grin. Because in an age obsessed with appearances, there was one universal truth. Behind every polished grin was someone else's skeleton. If you could step into a Victorian ballroom, your first thought might be, "Ah, elegance." Your second thought, about 3 seconds later, would probably be, "Dear God, what died in here?" Because behind the silks, jewels, and polished manners of the 19th century lurked a truth that no amount of lace could hide. Fashion stank. We begin in a cramped London workroom where a seamstress named Rose is bent over her sewing table, her fingers blistered from long hours of pinning, stitching, and repinning. Before her stands Miss Amelia, a young lady of status and expectations, trying on a new corset, one that promises to improve posture and discourage unseemly breathing. "Hold still, miss," Rose mutters gently, tugging at the laces. The corset creaks like an old ship in a storm. Amelia's face flushes as her waistline shrinks by degrees. "There," Rose says at last, tying the knot. "Perfect." Amelia exhales, or tries to. She dabs at her neck with a powder puff, releasing a small cloud of lavender-scented dust. The fragrance mixes with the room's natural perfume: hot wax, damp fabric, and human effort. To the Victorians, this was the price of beauty. Not just discomfort, but aroma. Because a fashionable woman wore, at minimum, 5 layers of clothing: chemise, corset, petticoat, crinoline, overskirt, and gown. Each layer was a trap for heat, sweat, and everything else that dared to emerge from a human body. The result? A kind of portable greenhouse effect, elegant on the outside, steamy within. Still, fashion was sacred. Women were expected to appear graceful and composed, regardless of the climate or the faint scent of cooked humanity. Now, to the untrained nose, this might sound like a disaster. But to the Victorian elite, it was simply the smell of society. And rather than fight it, they masked it. Not with moderation, but with perfume. Lavender, rose, musk, and sandalwood filled the air like chemical diplomacy. Every social class had its own signature scent. The wealthy preferred subtle floral blends imported from France, bouquets that whispered refinement. The middle classes bought cheaper English colognes that shouted ambition. As for the poor, they smelled of life itself: coal smoke, iron, and lye. No lavender required. The irony, of course, was that the more perfume you wore, the worse the problem became. Heavy scents mixed with sweat candle smoke, and unwashed fabric to create what one observer called a bouquet of human persistence. By the mid-19th century, the perfume industry had become both an art and a weapon. Ladies carried pomanders, small silver balls filled with herbs and perfume, to ward off foul air and fainting fits. They pressed them to their noses during carriage rides or church services, inhaling salvation one whiff at a time. Men carried scented handkerchiefs, dabbing them beneath their nostrils as if perpetually insulted by the world around them. Perfume was more than hygiene. It was hierarchy. The poor couldn't afford to smell like roses, and even if they could, society wouldn't believe them. A perfumed working woman was often assumed to be a courtesan. Fragrance was scandalous when worn below a certain income level. Thus, scent became another form of class distinction, invisible but powerful. A duchess's lavender was refinement. A laundress's lavender was suspicion. Now let's follow Amelia to the highlight of her week, the ball. She arrives at the grand hall by carriage, cheeks powdered, hair lacquered, corset drawn to military precision. The chandelier glitters overhead, and the orchestra plays something suitably romantic. At first glance, it's a dream, a swirl of gowns and coattails, candlelight and charm. But step inside, and your senses revolt. The air is thick, stifling, syrupy, alive, a mixture of sweat, perfume, cigar smoke, and humanity condensed into a single, luxurious cloud. The newspapers called them stinking ballrooms, though never to the hosts' faces. Guests waved their fans not for elegance, but for survival, generating faint breezes of perfumed futility. Every smile glistened with effort. Every breath was an act of bravery. The windows remained shut. Open windows meant drafts, and drafts meant scandalous shivers. So the smell grew and grew, until the very air seemed upholstered. Still, everyone pretended not to notice. Politeness demanded that noses be blind. After all, these were the finest families in England. And if civilization had to reek to prove it existed, then so be it. Meanwhile, back in the workroom, Rose the seamstress continues stitching by candlelight. Her own dress is patched and plain, but the faint trace of soap clings to it, her only luxury. She'll never attend a ball, but she can always tell when one is happening nearby. The scent drifts through open windows the next morning, a ghostly mix of perfume and fatigue, like flowers dying under velvet. Rose smiles faintly as she folds a gown for repair. She knows the truth that the fine ladies never admit, that glamour always smells a little rotten up close. Perfume makers of the era leaned into that paradox. They sold bottled illusions, floral fantasies designed to convince their wearers they were floating above the filth. One French chemist even described his work as the translation of sin into scent. He wasn't wrong. A drop behind the ear, a dab on the wrist. Each gesture a prayer to the gods of denial. But the Victorians were masters of denial. They denied sweat. They denied odor. They denied that human bodies were, in fact, human. And so, they marched through crowded rooms, through sooty streets and suffocating parlors, wrapped in corsets and confidence, trailing clouds of moral superiority and sandalwood. When the night ended, the candles guttered and the carriages rolled away. The truth lingered in the air, a heady mix of rose, rum, and exhaustion. Maids opened the ballroom doors the next morning and recoiled. The chandeliers still sparkled, the floors gleamed. But the scent was indescribable, equal parts wealth and entropy. They opened the windows. Slowly, London's natural air, no cleaner, but at least honest, drifted back in. Fashion, for all its grandeur, had always been a game of deception. The Victorians simply played it with more layers, more lace, and far more perfume. The corsets shaped the body, the fragrances shaped the illusion, and both demanded sacrifice, of comfort, of truth, and occasionally of breathable air. But that was the way of the age, to suffer beautifully, and to smell like you weren't suffering at all. So the next time you spritz your favorite perfume before heading out, think of Miss Amelia and her lavender powder, of gentlemen fanning themselves through stinking ballrooms, and of Rose who stitched their gowns and smelled the aftermath. Because in the end, Victorian fashion didn't conceal the smell of life. It simply made it fashionable. Perfume didn't fight the smell. It joined the army. The Victorians liked to think of their homes as sanctuaries, neat, moral, and separate from the chaos of the world outside. But the truth was harder to ignore once you stepped through the front door and took your first breath. Because Victorian homes breathed back, and what they exhaled was rarely pleasant. Picture a modest London parlor around 1875, the kind owned by a clerk and his family. Cozy, yes. Respectable, certainly. But also faintly damp, smoky, and alive in ways no architect intended. The air is thick with coal smoke from the fireplace, the beating heart of the home, and the villain of every laundry day. A kettle whistles on the hob, adding steam to the mix, while a pot of beef stew simmers, fragrant, fatty, and slightly burnt at the edges. The wallpaper glistens faintly with condensation, its floral pattern slowly peeling in defeat. Beneath the carpet, the floorboards creak like lungs trying to cough. The family doesn't notice. They've adapted. You can get used to anything if you breathe it long enough. The father, Mr. Ellis, sits by the fire reading the Times, his spectacles fogged. The children build a tower of wooden blocks nearby, while Mrs. Ellis opens the door to let in some air, only to find the street outside even worse. A fog of soot and horse dung rolls in, carrying the perfume of London itself. Progress, poorly ventilated. She shuts the door again and sighs. Best not waste the warmth, she murmurs. She knows the truth every housewife learns. A Victorian home is an ecosystem. Every pot of stew, every candle flame, every damp sock drying by the fire contributes to the indoor weather. And the air, poor thing, can only hold so much. So, the women of the house wage a quiet daily war against smell. They set out bowls of vinegar in the corners of rooms to purify the air. They burn herbs, rosemary, sage, or sometimes lavender, though these often smell like a funeral if burned too long. On better days, Mrs. Ellis sprinkles the floorboards with tea leaves before sweeping. It's said to catch the dust. On worse days, she just hopes her visitors are polite enough not to mention the damp. There's no shame in it, really. London's climate seems to exist for the sole purpose of making fabric clammy. Walls perspire, windows sweat. Every home, rich or poor, hums with moisture. But to the Victorians, freshness meant virtue. A clean-smelling home wasn't just pleasant, it was moral. Odor suggested moral decay, and nothing terrified a respectable housewife more than the faint suspicion that her hallway might smell of sin. Of course, that ideal of purity didn't reach everyone. Across the river, in the crowded slums of Southwark and Whitechapel, the air told a different story, one that couldn't be disguised with lavender. Here, the smells were maps, a whole language of life and loss. The reek of frying onions might mean someone finally had enough money for dinner. The sharp bite of carbolic soap meant sickness in the house, or recovery, if luck held. A sudden sweet, sour stench drifting through a hallway meant something else entirely. A fever, a body, or a story about to end. In these narrow courts, you could smell before you could see. The air clung to you like another skin. A journalist once wrote that the poor breathe what they eat and eat what they breathe. He wasn't exaggerating. 10 people might share a single room. One pot, one fire, one window nailed shut against the cold. The air moved slowly, thick as broth. But even here, people found ways to make life bearable. Housewives hung bunches of mint near the door. Rag pickers burned scraps of cedar. Mothers boiled soap in kettles and called it spring cleaning, though spring rarely reached the East End. And when the smell turned bad, when something in the next room began to decay, they simply opened a window and whispered a prayer. Because in London, prayers were often the only thing that got through the smog. Up the social ladder, the wealthy fought the same battle, just with more perfume and denial. In the mansions of Kensington, servants hurried to refresh the drawing rooms with benzoin incense and ozonizers, little contraptions that sparked electricity to electrify the air, though mostly they just startled the cat. Fashionable hostesses swore by scented fans, waving away unpleasantness with practiced grace. Guests smiled, pretending not to notice the blend of roast beef, wax, and perspiration drifting beneath the chandelier. It was a genteel kind of suffocation, the sort where everyone agreed not to mention they were choking. Back in the Ellis home, evening settles. The fire has burned low, and the air feels heavier, warmer, closer. Mrs. Ellis adds another scoop of coal, and the flames leap, releasing a fresh wave of comfort and carbon monoxide. She sets the vinegar bowl on the mantel and straightens the picture frame above it. The smell doesn't fade exactly, but it changes, the way a melody does when it's played by a different instrument. The children are asleep now, curled under wool blankets that smell faintly of wet sheep. Mr. Ellis snores softly in his chair. For a moment the house seems peaceful. Then the wind rattles the window pane, carrying a faint odor from the river, that eternal mixture of decay and empire. Mrs. Ellis doesn't flinch. She's used to it. She knows the scent of her home by heart. It's not pleasant, but it's hers. It smells of soup and soot and small triumphs. She sits down, exhales, and closes her eyes. Later that night, in a house across town, a woman wakes coughing, not from sickness, but from the staleness of the air. She lights a candle, watches the flame flicker, and wonders how something invisible can feel so heavy. Outside, the fog drifts past rows of chimneys. London sleeps under its own breath, the city inhaling and exhaling in slow, smoky rhythm. Every house a lung, every window a throat, every wall holding its secrets close. The Victorians didn't have air purifiers or scented candles, but they understood one truth perfectly. A home should smell like life. Sometimes that meant stew and coal dust. Sometimes that meant sickness and sorrow. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it meant a baby's blanket drying by the fire. They may not have been able to scrub away the world, but they made the air theirs, one bowl of vinegar at a time. By dawn, the fires have burned out. The houses breathe again, quietly. If you walk through the early streets, you'll catch it, the mingled scents of bread baking, milk steaming, chimneys coughing, the city waking up, scented with everything it is. Every doorway has a fragrance, sometimes love, sometimes rot, usually both. One upstairs, one down, both sweating, one from lace, the other from labor, and between them lies everything you need to know about Victorian womanhood, the rules, the silence, and the scent of endurance politely disguised as refinement. It's a July afternoon in 1881. Upstairs, Lady Margaret Ashcombe reclines faintly in her dressing chair, fanning herself against the heat. Her corset creaks like an overburdened carriage wheel. Downstairs in the scullery, Annie, her maid, stands elbow deep in a basin of soapy water, scrubbing that very same corset clean, along with several others. The difference is that Margaret sweats from constraint. Annie sweats from work. Neither of them can breathe freely. The air in the small washroom is thick with soap and vinegar, the kind of smell that clings to skin for hours. Corsets were intimate things, molded by the body and stained by it. Sweat, powder, perfume, sometimes blood. Annie works quickly, her fingers red from the lye. She doesn't mind the smell. To her, it's simply the scent of wages. Upstairs, Lady Margaret lifts her arms as her new corset is laced on by a younger maid. The girl tugs the laces, and Margaret lets out a small gasp. Part discomfort, part ritual. "Not too tight," she whispers, though of course it is. Tightness is the point. The tighter the waist, the higher the moral standard, or so the magazines suggest. Her perfume, violet water imported from France, fills the room, masking everything beneath. The fragrance is delicate, but it has a job to do. It tells the world she is composed, even if she isn't. Victorian women lived in layers of fabric, of expectation, of silence. And perhaps nowhere was that silence heavier than in how they managed their own bodies. Menstruation, for instance, was never mentioned in polite conversation. It barely appeared in medical texts, except in vague Latin euphemisms. Doctors referred to it as the monthly obstruction, or the periodical inconvenience, as if embarrassment could cure it. There were no disposable pads, no pain relievers, no products stamped with pink flowers and false reassurance. Just wool, linen, and improvisation. A middle-class woman might cut old bandages into strips and wash them discreetly afterward. Working women used rags, hence the enduring, unflattering phrase, "on the rag." Poorer women sometimes went without altogether, relying on layers of clothing and an iron will. It was not hygienic. It was survival. And through it all, the smell: iron, vinegar, soap, and shame. There's a kind of quiet tragedy in how the Victorians treated the most natural parts of life. Women were expected to appear ethereal, graceful, unflushed, unscented, as though they floated through the world untouched by biology. The ideal woman didn't sweat. She glowed. She didn't bleed. She took to her room. And she certainly didn't talk about it. When the novelist George Eliot once hinted at menstruation in private letters, her publisher advised her never to mention such things again. "Readers," he said gravely, "should not be reminded that heroines are human." Downstairs, Annie wrings out another corset and hangs it by the fire. She's been bleeding for 2 days now, quietly, painfully, pretending not to. The water at her feet is pinkish, but no one will ask why. She moves slower than usual, but she doesn't stop. In service, your body doesn't belong to you. It's a tool for labor, not conversation. When she finishes, she washes her hands, dries them on her apron, and takes a small whiff of lavender water from a bottle she keeps hidden behind the stove. It's cheap, sharp, and medicinal, but it covers the sour tang of sweat and soap. She calls it her Sunday perfume. It's the only thing she owns that feels private. Upstairs, Lady Margaret does the same thing, in her own way. Before joining her husband for dinner, she dabs violet perfume behind her ears, at her throat, and on her wrists. The The gesture is identical to Annie's, though they'd never see it that way. Perfume, for both of them, is a shield, a small, fragrant rebellion. The world smelled different depending on who you were allowed to be. A lady's scent was supposed to whisper, faint, floral, barely there. The fragrance of virtue, one magazine called it. A servant's scent, if noticed at all, was considered an offense. And if a woman smelled of sweat, or blood, or vinegar, of effort, that wasn't femininity. It was failure. Yet even within those rules, women carved small sanctuaries of scent. Rosewater on pillowcases, lavender tucked into drawers, vinegar in the air to mask the smell of damp laundry. These were acts of defiance disguised as housekeeping. Small claims of dignity in a world that demanded denial. Doctors, of course, had opinions. They always did. Medical journals warned that overexertion during menstruation could cause nervous disorders, and even madness. One suspects the madness came from being told that sitting still would cure everything. Some physicians recommended that women avoid reading novels during their cycle, lest heightened emotions disturb the uterine balance. Naturally, no one gave similar advice to men. In truth, most women simply endured. They stitched, scrubbed, and smiled through cramps, headaches, and endless layers of cloth. They were expected to be angels, immaculate in smell and spirit, even when their bodies reminded them otherwise. And when they couldn't hide it, they used scent to rewrite the story. A drop of perfume was not vanity, it was armor. For a maid, it said, "I am still a person beneath the uniform." For a lady, it said, "I am still in control, even when I'm not." At night, when the house falls silent, Annie creeps into the servants' quarters and lies down on her narrow bed. The air is heavy with starch and soap. She closes her eyes, her body aching in the familiar way. Upstairs, Lady Margaret does the same. In a softer bed, in a cleaner room, but with the same ache beneath her ribs. Two women, two worlds, same biology, different freedoms, both breathing through the scent of silence. The Victorians liked to call this modesty. They built a culture around not mentioning what every woman knew in her bones. And when reality threatened to show through the cracks, they drowned it in lavender water and polite fiction. Because sometimes modesty isn't virtue. Sometimes it's survival. Powdered, perfumed, and pressed into silence. And so, as London sleeps, upstairs and down, in parlors and attics, the air carries the faint perfume of endurance. It's the scent of clean linen, faint soap, and secrets shared by half the human race. They called it modesty. It was survival in disguise. You get to hear their stories without scrubbing a single corset. The least you can do is subscribe. Summer again, the city's most treacherous season. The air hangs thick and warm, the streets hum with flies, and somewhere in Soho, a mother watches her child drink from a public water pump that everyone believes to be pure. By nightfall, the child is dead. By morning, the neighbors are coughing. Within a week, half the street smells faintly of sickness and carbolic. Cholera has returned. And once again, everyone blames the air. To the Victorians, disease was an olfactory affair. You didn't catch illness, you smelled it. The theory of miasma ruled medicine. The belief that foul odors carried sickness, that disease drifted through the air like invisible smoke. It made a strange sort of sense in a world that always reeked of something. And so, when cholera began its grim rounds, the response was as predictable as it was tragic. Open the windows, burn incense, and pray the wind blows the right way. doctors roamed the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, soaked in vinegar or perfume. Respectable families sealed their doors with tar-soaked cloths to keep the bad air out, though the air inside was hardly better. It was a time of contradictions. They were terrified of breathing, but no one thought to question what they were drinking. One doctor, writing in his journal that year, described the atmosphere in London as a great vapor of mortality. He wore gloves and a silk scarf even in August, and still went home each night convinced he could feel the disease clinging to him. It was superstition in a stethoscope, well-meaning, desperate, and profoundly wrong. But not everyone accepted it. Enter Florence Nightingale, the woman who scrubbed death until it looked respectable. By the time of the Crimean War, Nightingale was already preaching her gospel of cleanliness, air, and light. She believed that disease flourished in filth, not because of invisible microbes, she wasn't there yet, but because bad smells were moral failures. To her, dirt was a sin, and soap its salvation. At Scutari Hospital, she ordered windows flung open, floors scrubbed, linens boiled, and soldiers washed. The doctors balked, she insisted. Soon, the death rate fell, the patients improved, and a legend was born, not just of the lady with the lamp, but of the saint of sanitation. Her theory was half right, half miracle. Clean air didn't cure infection, but it certainly helped stop the spread of filth-borne disease. She'd been fighting the right battle, just in the wrong language. And like all good reformers, she made cleanliness contagious. Still, the miasma believers persisted. They were everywhere, in Parliament, in medicine, in the sermons of well-fed clergymen who warned that foul odors offend both man and God. To the Victorian establishment, miasma wasn't just science, it was morality disguised as health. If you lived in a stinking neighborhood, you were suspect. If you fell ill, it was probably your fault. Proof you hadn't kept your house, your habits, or your soul clean enough. The poor, of course, had no choice but to breathe whatever air their landlords allowed. And yet, for all its cruelty, miasma theory offered comfort. It gave people something to blame, something they could see or smell, even if it wasn't true. But in 1854, one man began to challenge it. His name was Dr. John Snow, not a novelist, not a rebel, just a quiet physician with a notebook and a stubborn streak. When cholera swept through Soho that summer, Snow noticed something odd. The disease didn't follow the wind, as the miasma maps claimed. It followed the water. He walked the streets, knocking on doors, asking the same grim question. Who has been ill? He marked each death with a dot on his map, one for every house, every life. Soon, the pattern emerged. The dots clustered around a single water pump on Broad Street. He traced the pump's source to a well contaminated by sewage, likely from a leaking cesspit nearby. And just like that, the invisible enemy had a face. Not bad air, but bad water. Snow presented his findings to the authorities, who responded with the enthusiasm of a man told to give up his favorite superstition. Impossible, they said. Air kills, not water. But Snow persisted. He convinced the local council to remove the pump handle. Within days, the outbreak slowed. The air, of course, smelled no better, but the dying stopped. It was the first major victory for what would later be called germ theory, though no one yet had the microscope to prove it. While Snow was out mapping the living and the dead, London itself remained a vast, open experiment in infection. The Thames still carried the waste of millions. Water companies still drew drinking water from the same river they used as a sewer. And every few years, the city learned the same lesson again. Painfully, publicly, fatally. Doctors argued, clergymen sermonized, reformers wrote pamphlets. But slowly, the world began to change. Bazalgette's sewers took shape beneath the streets. Soap factories multiplied. Hospitals began to disinfect. And the air, though still foul, was no longer blamed for every cough. Of course, the miasma didn't die easily. Old ideas rarely do. Even after Snow's findings, people continued to burn herbs and carry scented sponges. Florence Nightingale herself never fully accepted germ theory. She believed in God's air until her dying day. But the tide was turning. Microscopes revealed tiny organisms dancing in water droplets, invisible killers that smelled of nothing at all. The truth, it turned out, was odorless. And that was perhaps the hardest thing for Victorians to believe, that danger could come without warning, without scent, without sin. Cholera, in the end, changed more than medicine. It changed how people thought about cities, about cleanliness, about connection. No longer was disease a private punishment. It was a public problem, something shared, something fixable. London had coughed, and science had finally started to listen. Dr. Snow never saw the full triumph of his discovery. He died young, his theories still doubted by many of his peers. Florence Nightingale continued to preach her gospel of open windows and clean sheets, and the city continued to build, brick by brick, sewer by sewer, towards something better. The age of bad air was ending, though it would take a few more plagues, a few more skeptics, and a few more funerals to bury it. But the truth had been uncorked at last. No perfume could disguise it. No prayer could change it. It moved quietly, under the lens of a microscope, across a doctor's map, through one clean drop of water at a time. The truth was coming. One cough, one microscope slide at a time. London had done something remarkable. It had learned at last to breathe. The air still carried its share of smoke and scandal, of course, but the suffocating stench that once defined the empire's capital was fading. Slowly, steadily, the city was washing itself clean. It had taken half a century of sickness, sermons, and sheer stubbornness to get there. But progress, like soap, always leaves bubbles behind. Down beneath the cobblestones, Joseph Bazalgette's sewers now stretched for miles, brick-lined arteries humming with purpose. They were beautiful, in a way that only engineers could love. Vast tunnels of red brick, arched and echoing, carrying away what London once preferred to ignore. Each day, millions of gallons of wastewater flowed through those tunnels out to the Thames estuary and into the sea, far enough away that nobody important complained. Bazalgette had done it. He'd given the city a digestive system. The Thames, once a corpse of a river, began to heal. The newspapers called it the Great Cleansing. The fish began to return. The citizens, however, took longer to follow suit. The Victorians had built their filth slowly, and they were suspicious of cleanliness that arrived too fast. But soon, the difference became impossible to deny. The river that had once smelled like punishment now glimmered faintly in the morning light, and for the first time in centuries, Londoners could walk by its banks without fainting or moralizing. Progress, at long last, had a scent, and it wasn't vinegar. Above ground, the public bathhouses were spreading, brick temples of steam and civility, built for those who had never before had the luxury of washing in private. In Whitechapel and Clerkenwell, queues formed on Saturday evenings. Dock workers, clerks, maids, and chimney sweeps clutching towels and halfpennies. For a few blissful minutes, they could stand beneath a warm stream of water, feel it pour down their backs, and imagine themselves, briefly, clean. A journalist described one man stepping under the tap for the first time. He gasped, laughed, and muttered, "Blimey, it goes away by itself." For a people raised on basins and buckets, the idea that water could arrive and depart without hauling was nothing short of sorcery. There's a quiet poetry in that image. A working man, soap in hand, marveling not at luxury, but at escape. For the first time, the dirt of the city didn't linger. It left. Meanwhile, in homes across Britain, new inventions trickled in. The humble indoor tap, the miraculous flushing toilet, and even the first primitive showers resembling metallic umbrellas that spat cold water with military enthusiasm. Victorian newspapers called them modern marvels. Servants called them troubles waiting to happen. Still, the world was changing. Soap factories expanded by the riverbanks, belching white steam instead of black smoke. Brands like Piers, Sunlight, and Lever Brothers turned hygiene into empire, exporting cleanliness as a moral export. "Soap is civilization," one advertisement boasted, and the world dutifully lathered up. Colonial officers carried bars of English soap to India, Africa, and the Caribbean, preaching purity with missionary zeal. Hygiene became an imperial mission. If Britain couldn't save your soul, it could at least scrub your skin. It was progress, perfumed, and like all perfume, it concealed as much as it revealed. But let's stay with London, for it had earned its bath. Street by street, the city was remade. Pavements widened, drains deepened, hospitals disinfected. The word sanitation entered common speech, and with it, a new kind of optimism. Doctors now washed their hands before surgeries. Nurses boiled their instruments. Even barbers began cleaning their razors, reluctantly but consistently. And beneath it all, the quiet hum of Bazalgette's brick labyrinth kept the rhythm of reform. Every flush, every drain, every bath poured into his masterpiece. He had built for the future, he'd said, and he was right. His tunnels were twice the size they needed to be. He'd built them that way, prophetically muttering, "Whatever happens, London will grow." He was thinking of people. He couldn't have known he was also building for time. His sewers would still serve the city more than 100 years later, long after the empire that funded them had crumbled into history. Up above, Florence Nightingale's disciples continued to scrub the world. Hospitals gleamed white. Bed linens were bleached within an inch of their fibers. The old gospel of bad air had finally given way to a new religion, germ theory. No longer was smell the villain. The invisible had been found, labeled, studied, and, most importantly, washed away. The microscope replaced the handkerchief. Science replaced incense. And for the first time in human memory, people began to realize that cleanliness wasn't moral. It was practical. The notion scandalized the Victorians at first. The idea that disease had nothing to do with sin, that filth was not fate, but fixable. It was radical. It made everyone, rich and poor alike, culpable in a new way. If cleanliness could save lives, then dirt wasn't destiny. It was a choice. And that terrified as many people as it enlightened. By 1900, the transformation was nearly complete. London was no longer the great stink. It was the modern metropolis, the envy of Europe. Its skyline smoked with factories, yes, but beneath the smoke, there was order. Drains that worked, water that flowed, air that usually didn't kill. In a working man's home, a child splashed in a tin tub with real soap bubbles, the kind that didn't sting your eyes. His father poured warm water from a kettle, smiling faintly as he watched it swirl down the drain. For once, the smell of progress was clean. And yet, in a way, the ghosts of the old world lingered, faint, like the afterscent of coal smoke on morning air. The Victorians had washed their hands, but not their consciences. Cleanliness still carried judgment. Poverty still had a smell. And for all their progress, they still believed that purity could be purchased. Soap was now a symbol of empire, an object lesson wrapped in lather. But for the millions who had lived through the filth, who had known the river's rot and the city's breath, that didn't matter. They had survived the stink, and survival, at last, smelled sweet. So the century closed with London reborn, its sewers singing softly beneath the streets, its chimneys less cruel, its people a little cleaner and a little wiser. The city that had once drowned in its own dirt had found redemption not in perfume, nor in prayer, but in pipes, soap, and stubbornness. And as the lamps flickered across the Thames and the night settled over the rooftops, the air moved gently through the city, not quite fresh, but close enough. Progress, after all, has a scent of its own. Not roses, not vinegar, something quieter, something earned. The smell fades, the empire washes up. And for the first time in history, London breathes easy. And now, here we are. The candles have burned low, the chimneys have gone quiet, and the city that once stank of ambition and sewage exhales softly beneath a cleaner sky. London, that proud, pungent heart of the 19th century, finally smells like tomorrow. You've wandered through its fog and its filth, through ballrooms and bathhouses, sewers and silks. You've met laundresses and doctors, maids and ministers, each of them scrubbing, coughing, or perfuming their way toward modern life. And now the air feels lighter. Bazalgette's tunnels hum quietly below. Florence Nightingale's hospitals gleam above. John Snow's pumps stand dry but victorious. The empire, for all its soap and sermonizing, has washed up, rinsed in reform and wrung out by progress. For the first time in centuries, London isn't gagging on itself. It's breathing, and so are we. The smell is gone, but the echoes remain. A faint ghost of coal smoke and lavender, vinegar and virtue. A reminder that history isn't always glorious. Sometimes it just smells a little better when it's over. They built railways, sewers, and empires, but the greatest invention of all was the idea that being clean didn't have to mean being holy, just healthy. And that's the quiet triumph of it, isn't it? Humanity learned to scrub its hands, wash its cities, and face its reflection without flinching. London lost its famous smell. Humanity gained its first breath of modernity. So if you're still awake, congratulations. You've just walked through the dirtiest century in history and come out spotless. Now, take a deep breath. Imagine the city lights flickering over the Thames, the last traces of smoke drifting away into night. You can almost smell the clean air, can't you? Go ahead, let your eyes close. And before you drift off completely, remember, subscribing isn't just an act of curiosity, it's an act of hygiene. Consider it your way of keeping history fresh, and me, slightly less smelly for the next episode. Because every listen, every like, every sleepy subscriber keeps these stories alive, scrubbed, polished, and told with care. So thank you, truly, for helping me wash off another century. Now sleep well. The past is clean for tonight.